The blizzard on Hollow Hill. It was a typical winter evening in the small town of Hollow Hill, a place that seemed frozen in time. The snow had started to fall early that day, blanketing the roads and houses in a thick layer of white. By nightfall, the storm had turned into a full-blown blizzard, with howling winds and zero visibility. Sophie and her younger brother Lucas were stuck at home, the storm cutting off all travel in and out of the town. Their parents had gone out earlier in the day, hoping to return before the storm worsened. But as the hours passed and the storm raged on, Sophie grew more and more anxious. Around midnight, a loud knock echoed through the house. Sophie opened the door, finding a man standing on the doorstep, drenched in snow, his face pale and gaunt. "I need shelter," the man said in a hoarse voice. "Please, I've been walking for hours." Against her better judgment, Sophie let him in. The man introduced himself as Daniel, a traveler who had gotten lost in the storm. He was clearly exhausted, and Sophie felt a pang of sympathy. She offered him a seat by the fire and gave him some tea. As the night wore on, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about Daniel. His eyes seemed too wide, his smile too forced. He spoke in riddles, asking strange questions about the town, its history, and the people who lived there. But it wasn't until Lucas went to bed that Sophie noticed something truly unsettling. Daniel had been sitting by the fire, but now he was standing by the window, staring out into the storm. "It's not safe out there," Sophie said, her voice trembling. Daniel turned slowly, his face expressionless. "It's not safe in here either," he whispered. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. Suddenly the lights flickered, and the temperature dropped dramatically. Sophie looked around, and for the first time she realized the house felt empty. The warmth from the fire seemed to vanish, replaced by an icy chill. Then, without warning, Lucas screamed from upstairs. Sophie rushed up to find him in his room, clutching the bedpost in terror. "There's someone in the house, Sophie," he cried, his voice cracking. Sophie looked around frantically, but there was no sign of anyone. The house seemed silent, too silent. The storm outside was deafening, but inside, everything was eerily still. The next morning, the storm had finally begun to subside, but the house was not as Sophie remembered. The windows were covered in frost, and the walls were damp. As she went to check on Daniel, she found his belongings scattered across the living room. His shoes, his coat, and a set of muddy footprints leading toward the back door. But there was no sign of Daniel. Confused and terrified, Sophie tried to call her parents, but the phone lines were down. She went outside, hoping to find help, but the snow had piled up so high that the town was completely isolated. It wasn't until she ventured toward the edge of the property that she saw something she couldn't explain. There, in the snow, was a set of footprints leading into the woods, footprints that led nowhere. They just stopped. As Sophie stood frozen in place, trying to make sense of what she was seeing, she heard a voice behind her. "You should have never let him in." She turned around, only to find a woman standing in the snow, her face pale and frozen. The woman stepped forward, her eyes filled with sorrow. "He's not human," she whispered. "He's a spirit. He's been trapped here for decades, and every time the snowstorm hits, he comes looking for someone to take his place." Sophie's blood ran cold as the woman continued. "You see, Daniel isn't lost in the storm. He's the storm. Every time the blizzard comes, he feeds on the living. But if you survive, he'll disappear, only to return when the next snowstorm comes." Sophie ran back to the house, but it was too late. Daniel, or whatever he was, had already found Lucas. Sophie fought to save her brother. But as the storm roared around them, she realized there was no escape. In the end, Sophie and Lucas were never found. Their house was abandoned, and the storm never stopped. Some say the storm still rages on in Hollow Hill, and on the coldest nights, you can hear the faintest knock on your door. Years passed since Sophie and Lucas disappeared, and the town of Hollow Hill slowly moved on. The house where they had lived stood abandoned, a decaying reminder of the horrors that had once unfolded there. The snowstorms, though still frequent, had become a part of the town's winter routine, no one daring to speak of the tragedy that had struck the family. But for those who lived nearby, there were whispers of strange happenings, disappearances that followed the worst blizzards, unexplained sounds echoing from the woods, and the unsettling feeling that something wasn't quite right. It was the winter of 2023 when a young couple, Adam and Sarah, moved into the house. They were looking for a fresh start, eager to leave behind their busy lives in the city. The house on Hollow Hill seemed perfect, isolated, quiet, and full of character. They had heard the rumors about the place, but Adam, ever the skeptic, dismissed them as nothing more than ghost stories. Sarah, more sensitive to the atmosphere, felt uneasy, but didn't want to seem paranoid. On their first night in the house, a fierce snowstorm blew in, just as the old-timers in town had warned. The wind howled through the trees, and the snow quickly piled up, trapping them inside. As they sat by the fire, unpacking their belongings, Adam chuckled. "Just like a scene out of a horror movie, huh?" he joked, glancing out the window at the swirling white chaos. But Sarah wasn't laughing. She kept hearing strange noises from upstairs, like footsteps shuffling across the floor. At first she thought it was just the house settling, but the sound was too deliberate. She brushed it off, blaming the storm, but the uneasy feeling lingered. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, the storm grew fiercer. The house creaked and groaned under the pressure of the wind. She awoke suddenly, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. In the corner of the room, near the window, she saw a shadow. It wasn't the shape of any furniture, nor was it cast by the moonlight. It was a figure, a man standing motionless, staring at her. She blinked, and it was gone. But the fear stayed. Sarah tried to shake off the feeling, telling herself it was just her imagination. But the next morning, when she and Adam went downstairs to make breakfast, they found a set of muddy footprints leading from the front door, all the way through the hallway, and stopping at the base of the stairs. "Did you go outside last night?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Adam looked confused. "No, I didn't leave the house. I was right here with you the whole time." Sarah's heart raced. The footprints were fresh. There was no way they could have been there earlier. They weren't hers, and they weren't Adam's. As the days passed, the storm didn't let up. The winds continued to howl, and the snow buried everything in sight. But it wasn't the weather that unsettled Sarah. It was the strange occurrences inside the house. One evening, as they sat in the living room, a soft whisper reached her ears. It was barely audible at first, but it grew louder, as though someone was standing right behind her. She turned, but no one was there. Adam was asleep on the couch, unaware of the strange voices that filled the room. Sarah's curiosity got the best of her, and she ventured into the basement, thinking she might find some clue to explain the sounds. The basement was dark, filled with old furniture and dusty boxes. As she sifted through the debris, she came across a journal. The pages were yellowed with age, but the handwriting was still legible. It was a journal from the previous owners, Sophie and Lucas. The entries were filled with accounts of strange occurrences, the sounds, the footprints, the feeling of being watched. Sophie's last entry was a frantic scribble. "He's here. The storm has come again. We can't escape. He's not human. He's the storm." A cold shiver ran down Sarah's spine as she read the words. She realized with horror that Sophie's disappearance wasn't just a tragedy, it was a warning. That night, the storm reached its peak. The wind screamed like a living creature, rattling the windows and shaking the walls. As Sarah lay in bed, unable to sleep, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps upstairs. This time, they were louder, closer. The figure from the corner of her room seemed to return, and she could hear it breathing, slow and deliberate. She grabbed Adam, shaking him awake. "We need to leave, now." But as she looked at him, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Adam wasn't awake. He was still asleep, but his face was twisted in a grotesque expression. His eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. And then the whispers began again. This time they weren't coming from the house. They were coming from the walls. "Come, join us," the voice whispered, sending waves of terror through Sarah. "The storm never ends. You are one of us now." Desperate, Sarah tried to escape, but the house seemed to shift, trapping her inside. The storm outside intensified, and she could hear something, or someone, moving just behind her. The walls seemed to close in as the figure from her nightmares grew closer, its shadow flickering at the edges of her vision. Just as she thought she was doomed, Sarah found the door. With every ounce of strength, she shoved it open and ran into the snowstorm. But as she looked back, she saw the figure standing in the doorway, watching her, smiling in the cold darkness. Sarah never returned to Hollow Hill. She was found days later, miles away from the house, frozen in the snow. The townspeople say she was the last one to escape the storm, but some believe she never truly left. The storm, they say, is never over for those who encounter it. It follows them, always waiting for the next snowstorm to bring its next victim. The town of Hollow Hill had seen many winters, but none as bitter as the one that followed Sarah's disappearance. Her tragic end was a stark reminder of the chilling events that had haunted the town for decades. While the locals tried to move on, the stories persisted, passed down from generation to generation. Some spoke of the man who had walked through the snowstorm, the one who had come to claim those who ventured too close to Hollow Hill. Others said that the house had become cursed, a place where the blizzards never truly stopped. In the years that followed, no one dared to live in the house on Hollow Hill. It stood abandoned, slowly falling apart under the weight of the storms. The once welcoming structure had become a place of dread, where the winds howled like a chorus of lost souls. But as time wore on, curiosity had a way of drawing people back. One winter, a young investigator named James Turner arrived in Hollow Hill. He was a journalist from the city, determined to uncover the truth behind the eerie stories that had plagued the town for so long. He had heard whispers of Sophie and Lucas, Sarah, and the others who had vanished over the years, and he was determined to get to the bottom of it. James spent weeks in Hollow Hill, interviewing locals, sifting through old records, and combing through the snow-covered streets. Everyone had a theory, but no one knew the truth. The townspeople were reluctant to talk about the house and the storm that seemed to follow it. But James was persistent. He discovered that every major blizzard in the town's history had been linked to a disappearance. Some were simple travelers passing through. Others were long-time residents, but they all vanished when the storm reached its peak. The common thread, James realized, was the house. Every person who had gone missing had been somehow connected to the property on Hollow Hill. One evening, as James was poring over his notes, a strange feeling washed over him. The air in his small cabin grew thick, and the winds outside began to pick up, howling like a distant scream. He glanced out the window, his heart racing. The storm had returned. But this wasn't like any storm he had seen before. It wasn't just snow and wind. It was as if the very essence of the storm had taken on a life of its own. The trees swayed violently, and the snow fell in unnatural, swirling patterns. The temperature dropped sharply, and a strange, suffocating silence descended over the town. James tried to ignore the growing sense of dread gnawing at him. He told himself it was just a blizzard, a typical winter storm. But as the night wore on, he began to hear strange noises outside his cabin. Footsteps in the snow, the sound of a door creaking open, and then faint whispers. "Come closer," the voice called. "It's time for you to join us." Unable to resist, James grabbed his coat and rushed out into the storm. He knew where the whispers were coming from. The house on Hollow Hill. He had to go there to see if the stories were true. His heart pounded in his chest as he trudged through the deep snow, the howling winds almost deafening. But no matter how far he walked, the house seemed to loom closer, as if it were drawing him in. Finally, after what felt like hours, James reached the house. The door stood ajar, creaking in the wind. He stepped inside, his breath visible in the frigid air. The house was eerily quiet, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. He felt as though something was waiting for him in the shadows. As he ventured deeper into the house, James found remnants of the past, old photographs, forgotten belongings, and pieces of furniture left in haste. But the most unsettling discovery was in the basement. There, on a dusty old shelf, he found another journal, this one belonging to a man named Daniel. The pages were filled with accounts of strange events, much like the others he had read about, but the final entry was what chilled him to the bone. "The storm has returned. I can feel it. It has chosen me, and I will never leave. The house is alive. It will consume everything. I will become the storm." As James read the journal, the storm outside grew louder, its winds howling like the cries of the damned. Suddenly the house seemed to shift. The walls groaned, and the temperature plummeted. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, creeping closer. And then he heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him. James turned, but there was no one there. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. "Join us," they beckoned. "You're part of the storm now." His heart raced as he tried to escape, but the house seemed to close in on him. The door was no longer where it had been, and the hallway stretched endlessly in both directions. No matter how fast he ran, the walls shifted, trapping him inside. The storm had found him, just as it had found Sophie, Lucas, Sarah, and the others. James realized, too late, that he wasn't just fighting to survive the storm, he was becoming part of it. His body froze, his breath came in short gasps, and his mind became clouded. The storm had taken him, and now he was one of its many victims. The next morning, the storm subsided, but Hollow Hill remained silent. The house stood as it always had, abandoned, decaying, and forgotten by most. But the whispers of the storm continued, carried by the winds that still howled through the town. And as for James, his body was never found. Some say he was claimed by the storm, just as those before him had been. Others believe that he is still there, trapped within the walls of the house, waiting for the next blizzard to come. The people of Hollow Hill know the truth. The storm never ends. It waits, patiently, for its next victim to wander too close to the cursed house. And when the snow begins to fall, it's only a matter of time before the storm returns and takes another soul. It had been years since James disappeared, and the story of Hollow Hill had become nothing more than a dark legend in the town's history. The once bustling community had quieted, the streets now filled with a sense of unease whenever the weather grew harsh. Yet, in the midst of a particularly cold winter, a new face arrived in Hollow Hill. Emily Matthews, a writer from the city. Emily had heard the rumors of the cursed house and the town's strange connection to the snowstorms. She was no stranger to horror stories, having spent years researching and writing about urban legends and paranormal events. But something about the tale of Hollow Hill intrigued her more than anything else. She decided to make the town her new home, hoping to uncover the truth behind the storm, the house, and the people who had disappeared. When she first arrived, the town seemed quiet, almost deserted. The weather was unusually harsh, but Emily brushed it off as typical winter conditions. As she drove through the winding roads toward the heart of the town, she noticed the eerie stillness that seemed to permeate everything. There were no children playing in the snow, no laughter echoing through the streets. It was as though the town had been frozen in time. Emily's curiosity led her to the house on Hollow Hill, the very first evening she arrived. It was exactly as the locals had described. A large, decaying structure standing alone atop a hill, surrounded by nothing but a blanket of snow. The wind howled, and the trees bent under the weight of the storm. She stood there for a long moment, taking in the sight of the house. Despite its state of disrepair, there was something oddly compelling about it. Emily felt a pull, an invisible force urging her to step closer. The whispers she had heard about the house from the locals now seemed more real than ever. As she made her way toward the front door, she hesitated. It was as if the house was alive, watching her every move. But the desire to uncover the truth was stronger than her fear. She pushed the door open, and it creaked loudly, the sound echoing in the stillness. Inside, the house was even more unsettling. Dust covered the furniture, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling. But what caught Emily's attention was the cold. It wasn't just the chill of winter. It was something deeper, something unnatural. The air was thick, and the temperature dropped even further as she ventured inside. As Emily explored the house, she came across the same journal that James had found years before. It was hidden in the same place on a shelf in the basement. She opened it slowly, scanning the pages filled with frantic writing. It was a mixture of stories and warnings, but the last entry caught her eye. The storm will come again. It is not just weather. It is alive, and it chooses who it will take. The house is a gateway. It will take anyone who steps too close. The storm will never stop. I will become part of it. The words seemed to pulse on the page, as though the storm itself were speaking through the ink. Emily's hands trembled as she read. She knew then that the storm wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was something much darker, something tied to the house, to the land, to the very soul of Hollow Hill. That night, as the storm raged outside, Emily settled in the house, determined to spend the night there. The winds screamed against the walls, and the snow fell in thick sheets, covering the windows and turning the world outside into a swirling blur of white. But as the hours passed, something began to change. The temperature inside the house dropped even further, and Emily felt a presence, something lurking just beyond her vision. She heard faint whispers, like distant voices calling her name. Emily? At first she thought it was the wind, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, moving closer. The house groaned, as though it were alive, and the air became thick with a palpable sense of dread. She stood up, heart pounding in her chest, and made her way to the door. But when she tried to open it, she found that it wouldn't budge. It was as though the house had sealed itself shut, trapping her inside. Panic set in as she ran through the rooms, trying to find an escape. But everywhere she turned, the house seemed to stretch, the hallways growing longer and narrower. The whispers surrounded her, growing louder, more frantic. "Join us," the voices hissed. "You are part of the storm now." Emily's breath came in ragged gasps as she sprinted through the house, but no matter where she went, she couldn't escape. The walls closed in around her, and the whispers turned into screams. The storm outside raged with an intensity she had never heard before, as though it were right on top of her, suffocating her. She stumbled into the basement, hoping to find a way out, but what she found there was even worse. The walls were covered in old, faded photographs, images of people she didn't recognize, but whose faces seemed eerily familiar. And in the center of the room was a mirror, cracked and covered in frost. As Emily approached the mirror, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Her reflection wasn't her own. It was a distorted version of herself, eyes wide and filled with terror. And behind her, she saw the figure of a man, tall and shadowy, standing just out of view. Before she could react, the figure stepped forward, his cold, empty eyes locking with hers. The room spun as the storm's howl grew louder, drowning out everything else. The last thing Emily saw was the figure's outstretched hand reaching for her. The next morning the storm had passed, and the snow had stopped falling. The house on Hollow Hill stood as it always had, silent and abandoned. But Emily was gone. No one knew what had happened to her, and the house was left undisturbed, its dark secrets buried beneath the snow. But the people of Hollow Hill knew better. They knew that the storm would return. It always did. And each time it came, it took someone else. Someone who dared to uncover its secrets. Someone who got too close to the house on Hollow Hill. The storm was never over. It waited, and the house was always hungry for its next victim.